15 years, 5,475 days, every single one of them exactly the same. Until yesterday at precisely 1642. That was the exact moment the universe began to fracture around me. It didn't happen with an explosion or a blaring siren or a sudden flash of blinding light. It happened with a sound. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in a sound I had been listening to for over a decade. If you want to understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of that moment, you have to understand the absolute tyranny of routine that governed my life. I worked at a place we simply called the pool. It wasn't a clever code name, just a dry description of our reality. A massive, submerged research facility suspended in the crushing black depths of the North Pacific, exactly 200 miles off the coast of Hawaii. You don't just walk into the pool. You endure it. Every morning began the exact same way. I would swipe my badge at checkpoint 1, give the exact same nod to the exact same guard, Carl, who would offer the exact same grunt of acknowledgement without ever looking away from his monitors. Checkpoint 2 was the decontamination chamber. I'd stand there, arms raised like a criminal surrendering to the void, while the cold hiss of sanitizing spray washed over me, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial bleach. Checkpoint 3 was a retinal scan, forcing my eyes wide open to a harsh red laser. Checkpoint 4, the voice print. I would state my name, James Hughes, and my clearance level, and the machine would dissect the unique frequency of my vocal cords. Checkpoint 5, hand geometry. Checkpoint 6, weight distribution analysis, with a floor panels calculated if I'd gained or lost a fraction of a pound, checking for concealed items or sudden biological changes. Finally, checkpoint 7, the full-body millimeter wave scan. 43 minutes. Every single day. It took exactly 43 minutes from stepping off the transport helicopter to sitting down at my workstation. Consistency, predictability, control. The pool was a monument to human paranoia, designed to keep the most important secret in human history buried under millions of tons of freezing ocean. My desk was one of 20 identical stations arranged in a perfect semicircle. Above us, a domed ceiling blasted artificial, shadowless daylight that never wavered, completely severing us from the natural rhythms of the sun. But it was what lay below us that mattered. Through the reinforced, foot-thick glass flooring in the center of the room, you could see it. The object, even after 15 years of looking at it, my brain still struggled to process its physical presence. It floated suspended in a massive containment chamber, completely ignoring the laws of gravity in ways our brightest minds still couldn't map. It was about the size of a city bus, perfectly smooth and slightly oblong, but the color, or lack thereof, was what got to you. It wasn't black. It wasn't transparent. It just seemed to absorb the ambient light in a way that made your eyes water if you stared too long. It was an absence in space, something that simply did not belong in our three-dimensional world. My job, day in and day out, was mapping its atomic structure. For 15 years, I had stared at screens, tracking energy outputs, recording particle positions, measuring density. In all that time, we hadn't even scratched the surface. It was a monolith of absolute silence and stillness, retrieved from the deep Antarctic ice 27 years ago. Carbon dating suggested it had been trapped there for at least 12,000 years. 12,000 years of utter, unchanging silence, except for the hum. It was a low, vibrational buzz that sat right at the absolute edge of human hearing. It wasn't something you heard with your ears. It was something you felt in the fillings of your teeth and the hollow spaces of your skull. New transfers to the pool either couldn't detect it, or it drove them to the brink of insanity, making them beg for reassignment within weeks. But I had adapted. It had become the soundtrack to my isolation, as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. That was why yesterday afternoon, at 1642, my blood ran cold. I was staring at the particle distribution maps, letting my mind wander into a familiar, numb state that got me through the 12-hour shifts when I felt it. A microscopic pitch shift. It was a deviation of maybe 0.3%. A tiny flutter in the harmonic pattern. Most people wouldn't have noticed at all. But when you've lived inside a sound for a decade and a half, a change noted as violently jarring as a gunshot. I pulled out my earbuds. I turned my head, holding my breath, straining to listen. The hum had changed. It was richer, slightly higher, carrying a strange, undulating wave that made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I immediately checked the acoustic monitoring systems. The digital readouts glowed a calm, steady green. Normal parameters. The automated systems hadn't flagged a single thing. I manually adjusted the sensitivity, running a forced comparison against the baseline acoustic data from that morning. And there it was, a 0.3% shift. Tiny, insignificant to machines, but undeniably terrifyingly real. I documented it in my log, a brief note about a minor harmonic anomaly, trying to convince myself it was just a microscopic fluctuation that would correct itself. But the tension in my gut wouldn't loosen. Something fundamentally unchangeable had just changed. That unease followed me through the rest of my shift, through the sterile white corridors, and into the communication booths for my weekly video call with Emily. The comms room was a row of soundproof metal wall boxes, our only tether to the lives we left behind. When Emily's face appeared on a monitor, the guilt hit me with the same heavy, suffocating weight it always did. Her auburn hair was cut a little shorter. She looked tired. I forced a smile that felt like cracking plastic on my face. We went through the motions. She talked about her second-grade students, about a stray cat in the yard. And I lied. I told her the same lie I had been telling her since the day I took this job. I told her I was an oil platform engineer. It was the perfect cover story for the extreme isolation, the non-disclosure agreements, the months spent completely unreachable. Same as always, I told her, my voice hollow, lots of maintenance, lots of ocean. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The space between us wasn't just physical distance anymore. It was a chasm built out of 15 years of half-truths. When she quietly said we needed to talk about us and our future, when my rotation ended in 2 weeks, the knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, cold stone. I knew what that meant. The isolation was breaking her, just as it was slowly hollowing me out. I agreed, we disconnected, and I sat in that silent metal booth feeling entirely like a ghost. I barely slept last night. The shifted pitch of the object's hum seemed to follow me into my quarters, vibrating through the thin mattress. Which brings me to this morning. I went through the exact same morning routine. The exact same oatmeal in the cafeteria. The exact same walk through the 7 security checkpoints. Carl at the desk. The sanitizing spray. The retinal scan. But when I reached my workstation, the routine shattered permanently. Sitting dead center on my immaculate gray metal desk was a bright yellow post-it note. In the pool, there is no such thing as unauthorized stationery. Every pen, every digital tablet, every stylus is accounted for, tracked, and uniform. A yellow post-it note was an impossibility. It stood out like a beacon against the sterile environment. I froze. I looked around the semicircle of workstations. The other researchers were settling in, pulling up their morning diagnostics, completely oblivious. Nobody was looking at me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached out and picked it up. 6 words were written on it in blue ink. You have to leave now. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It wasn't a message that made my hands shake. It was the handwriting, the slightly cramped spacing, the way the T's were crossed with an unusually long, aggressive horizontal line, the slight downward slant of vowels. It was my handwriting, exactly mine, but I hadn't written it. I crumpled the note into my palm, shoving it deep into my uniform pocket, and dropped into my chair. My mind raced, slamming into logical walls and bouncing off. Someone had bypassed the pool security. Someone had bypassed the biometric scanners, walked onto the most heavily monitored research floor on the planet, placed an unauthorized piece of paper on my desk, and forged my handwriting with flawless precision. I immediately locked my terminal and bypassed the standard mapping software, pulling up the localized security footage from my specific workstation. The system required a live fingerprint press to access personal surveillance data, a protocol to stop researchers from sabotaging each other. The screen flickered, displaying the timestamp from yesterday evening, right after my shift ended. I fast-forwarded through hours of static emptiness. The cleaning drone swept through at midnight. Nothing. Then, at 2:17 in the morning, the motion sensors tripped. I slowed the playback to normal speed. Leaning so close to the monitor, my nose almost touched the glass. A figure walked into the frame. He was wearing the standard navy blue facility jumpsuit. He had the facility ID badge clipped to his breast pocket. He stopped in front of my chair. I stopped breathing. The man on the screen was me. It wasn't someone who looked similar. It wasn't a clever disguise. It was my face. The same tired lines around the eyes. The same slight stubble I had neglected to shave yesterday. The same posture. I watched, paralyzed with disbelief, as my exact double reached into his pocket, pulled out a small pad of yellow paper, and scribbled something down. He peeled the note off, stuck it to the center of my desk, and then looked up. He stared directly into the security camera. He stared directly at me. His expression was grim, terrified, and violently urgent. His lips moved, forming words a silent security feed couldn't capture, but the desperation in his eyes was deafening. Suddenly, movement at the edge of the frame. Daniel Cooper, the senior researcher from the workstation beside mine, walked into view. On the silent footage, Daniel looked alarmed. He threw his hands up, confronting my double. They exchanged heated words. My double reached into his pocket again and shoved something small. It looked like a secure data chip into Daniel's chest. Daniel grabbed it instinctively. Then my double took a step back, and he vanished. There was no trick of the light, no camera glitch. One single frame of a brilliant, blinding white flash that bleached the digital sensors. And in the next frame, the space was entirely empty. Daniel stood alone in the frame, staring at the empty air, his mouth hanging open. He looked around frantically, shoved the data chip into his own pocket, and sprinted out of the camera's view. I sat back in my chair, the air feeling impossibly thin. My lungs burned. I played the footage again, and again, and again. 7 checkpoints, biometric locks, a facility at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody breaks in, and nobody simply ceases to exist. I had to find Daniel. I abandoned my station, practically running down the gray corridors toward the cafeteria. The morning rush had cleared out, leaving only a few stragglers nursing their coffees before the 8 o'clock briefing. Daniel was sitting in the far corner, staring blankly at a digital tablet, stirring a cup of black coffee. I slid into the booth across from him, leaning in close, my voice a harsh whisper. "Daniel, we need to talk." He looked up, blinking as if pulling himself out of trance. "Morning, James. What's up?" His casual tone infuriated me. "Were you at my workstation last night? Around 2 a.m. Daniel's hand didn't pause in its stirring. His face remained a mask of mild confusion. "No, I was in my quarters after 9. "Why?" "Don't lie to me," I hissed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I just pulled my terminal security feed. I watched you talking to someone at my desk at 2:17. Someone who looked exactly like me. I watched him hand you a data chip, Daniel, and then I watched him disappear. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. A raw, naked panic flashed in Daniel's eyes, quickly buried under a forced, tight frown. He set a spoon down. "I have no idea what you're talking about, James. You must have been looking at corrupted data. A system glitch. I never left my room." "A system glitch doesn't forge my handwriting," I said, pulling the crumpled yellow note from my pocket and slamming it on the table between us. "He left this. A yellow post-it. They don't even exist down here. What did he give you, Daniel? What is going on?" Daniel stared at the yellow paper as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. He pushed his chair back violently, the metal legs screeching against the floor. "You need to take a break, James," Daniel said, his voice trembling slightly. "The isolation, the mapping work, it messes with your head. You're seeing things." I am not crazy. I grabbed his wrist as he tried to stand. He yanked his arm free, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "I can't help you, James," he whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee in pure fear. "If you know what's good for you, you'll delete that footage and you will never mention this to anyone. I really can't help you." He turned and practically fled the cafeteria. I sat there, the crumpled yellow note burning a hole in my hand. He was lying. He was terrified, and he was lying. By mid-morning, I couldn't focus. The 8 o'clock briefing had passed in a blur of mundane administrative updates from Director Peterson. No mention of security breaches. No mention of anomalies. Just a steady, suffocating drumbeat of routine. But the hum of the object below us felt different now. That 0.3% shift felt like a physical pressure building in my skull. I needed answers. And the only person with absolute, unrestricted access to the facility's internal sensors was Director William Peterson. I sent an urgent meeting request through the secure intranet. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside his office door. Enter. His crisp, metallic voice barked through the intercom. Peterson's office was as devoid of humanity as the man himself. Bare metal walls. No photographs. No personal effects. Just a massive, high-resolution schematic of the pool dominating the wall behind his sleek desk. He didn't look up from his tablet when I walked in. Hughes, what's so critical it pulls you off the mapping floor? I stood in front of his desk, my heart pounding in my throat. Sir, I believe we have a catastrophic security breach. That got his attention. Peterson slowly lowered his tablet, his pale blue eyes locking onto mine. Explain. I reached into my pocket and placed a smoothed-out yellow note on his desk. I found this on my terminal this morning. It's my handwriting, but I didn't write it. Furthermore, I reviewed my localized security footage. At 2:17 this morning, an unauthorized individual bypassed all biometric locks, entered the research floor, and stood at my desk. Peterson looked at the note, but made no move to touch it. His face was entirely unreadable. An unauthorized individual. Sir, he looked exactly like me, and after interacting with Daniel Cooper, the individual vanished. He didn't walk away. He disappeared in a flash of light. I have it all on tape. Peterson leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The low hum of the object seemed to vibrate through the soles of my boots. Have you spoken with Dr. Cooper about this? Peterson finally asked. Yes, he denied being there, but the footage is undeniable. Sir, the object's acoustic harmonics shifted yesterday. A 0.3% deviation. I logged it. I think the object is doing something. I think this breach is connected. Peterson sighed, a slow, calculated exhalation. He opened a drawer, pulled out a physical file folder, and opened it. Hughes, how long have you been assigned to pool? 15 years, sir. 15 years of staring at a static anomaly. 15 years of recycled air, artificial light, and 0 natural variables. Peterson closed the folder and looked at me with an expression of deep, patronizing pity. The human mind is a fragile mechanism, James. It searches for patterns where none exist. When deprived of stimulation, it will manufacture its own. I felt the blood drain from my face. Sir, I am not hallucinating. I have the digital evidence. Pull the footage yourself. Look at my terminal. I have already reviewed the centralized security logs for the entire facility. Peterson said smoothly. There were no unauthorized access alerts last night. No biometric overrides. And no one was on the research floor at 2:17. But my local feed. Your local feed is a localized system, susceptible to the same data corruption and fatigue-induced misinterpretation that you are currently suffering from. Peterson interrupted, his voice hardening into a blade. I am placing you on mandatory medical leave, effective immediately. You will report to Dr. Lansing in the psychiatric wing at 1400 hours for a full psychological evaluation. A psych evaluation? You think I'm making this up? I think you are suffering from acute confinement syndrome, Peterson said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. We have documented cases of perceptual distortions among long-term staff. It is an occupational hazard. You will speak to Dr. Lansing. You will take whatever medication she prescribes. And you will not discuss these paranoid delusions with any other members of the staff. Do I make myself clear? Researcher Hughes? It wasn't a question. It was a threat. If I pushed back, I wouldn't just be fired. People who lose their minds at a classified black site don't get sent home to their families. They get disappeared into secure medical facilities forever. Yes, Director. I forced the words out through a clenched jaw. I left his office feeling like the walls of the corridor were physically pressing in on me. I was completely isolated. Daniel was lying to cover his own skin. Peterson was burying the evidence. And my own mind was officially considered a liability. The evaluation with Dr. Lansing was a humiliating farce. She asked her clinical questions in a soothing, condescending tone. I played along. I lied, just like I lied to Emily. I told her I had been having vivid dreams, that the stress of the mapping project was getting to me. She smiled her practiced smile, prescribed a heavy bottle of antipsychotic sedatives, and told me to rest. I didn't take the pills. I went back to my quarters, locked the heavy metal door, and sat on the edge of my bed. The digital clock on the wall glowed a blood red. 23:40. The facility was entering its night cycle. The ambient lights dimmed to a dark blue. I pulled the yellow note from my pocket and stared at it in the dim light. You have to leave now. How? We were at the bottom of the ocean. There was no leaving. There was only the metal box, the crushing pressure of the water outside, and the object. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. The silence of the room pressed down on me, heavy and thick, but it wasn't silent. The hum, the relentless, low-frequency buzz of the object. I closed my eyes, trying to tune it out like I had every night for 15 years. But the pitch had changed. The 0.3% deviation was growing. It wasn't steady hum anymore. It was fluctuating, rising and falling in strange, rhythmic waves. It felt less like a vibration in the air and more like a pressure building up inside the fluid of my inner ear. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to force sleep to come. But the sound kept morphing. It began to fragment. The single, low drone started to split into multiple, distinct layers of audio. My breath hitched in my throat. I sat up in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just feeling the hum anymore. I was hearing it, and it wasn't mechanical noise. It was voices, thousands of them, faint, overlapping, and utterly chaotic. It sounded like standing outside a massive stadium, hearing the collective murmur of a restless crowd. The whispers danced just on the edge of comprehension. They were rising from the floorboards, bleeding out of the air vents, echoing directly inside my skull. I scrambled out of bed, backing into the corner of my room, my hands clamped over my ears. But it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. The object was waking up, and it was trying to communicate. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified, as the overlapping cacophony of whispers began to shift. The thousands of voices started to align, syncing up perfectly until the chaotic noise synthesized into one singular, unified frequency. The voices merged into a sound that felt ancient, cold, and impossibly vast. And then, clear as crystal echoing in the dark confines of my mind, they spoke. The voices did not speak a language, not in any human sense. It was a projection of pure, crushing intent, a sensory overload of meaning that bypassed my ears and injected itself directly into my cerebral cortex. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean without a suit, the pressure of 1 billion tons of water, suddenly manifesting as pure thought. Awake, that was the closest translation my fracturing mind could give to the sensation. A collective, ancient awareness stirring in the dark. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the cold metal wall of my quarters, my hands clutching my head, trying to physically hold my skull together. The sheer volume of the psychic noise was agonizing. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the darkness behind my eyelids offered no relief. The unified frequency held for a terrifying, breathless second, and then, just as suddenly as it had synchronized, it shattered. The single voice broke apart, descending back into the chaotic, overlapping murmur of thousands of distinct whispers. But they were no longer a distant hum. They were present. They were inside the room with me, inside my skin. That was the beginning of the 3 longest days of my life. 72 hours of unrelenting, maddening whispers. I dragged myself out of bed, the next morning feeling like a hollowed-out shell. My eyes were bloodshot, the skin underneath them bruised a sickly purple. I stood in the tiny, sterile shower of my quarters, turning the water temperature as high as I could stand, letting the scalding spray hit the back of my neck. I tried to focus on the physical pain of the heat, hoping it would drown out the phantom voices buzzing in my auditory nerve. It did nothing. The water hissed, and the whispers hissed back, riding the sound of plumbing, mocking me. I tried everything. I jammed foam earplugs deep into my ear canals. The whispers simply reverberated louder in the enclosed space of my head. I played authorized classical music to my earbuds at maximum volume, but the voices just wove themselves between the notes of the violins, turning Beethoven into a sinister, taunting chorus. The pool's absolute dedication to routine, which had once been my anchor, became an exquisite form of torture. I had to walk the same corridors, pass the same checkpoints, nod to the same guards, sit in the cafeteria and eat the same mechanically prepared food, all while desperately pretending that there wasn't a riot of invisible people screaming just out of earshot. The artificial daylight of the domed ceiling on the research floor burned my exhausted eyes. The other researchers went about their days, logging data, sipping coffee, complaining about the air filtration system. They looked so completely, infuriatingly bored. I wanted to grab them by their crisp, navy blue collars and scream at them. How can you not hear it? How can you sit there while the air is literally vibrating with them? But I kept my mouth shut. Director Peterson's threat hung over me like a guillotine. If I spoke up, if I showed even a single crack in my composure, I wouldn't just lose my job. I would vanish into a medical black site. So I sat at my workstation, my fingers trembling over the keyboard, pretending to analyze the same atomic alignments I had studied for 15 years. Except the alignments weren't the same anymore. When I looked at my monitors, the digital representations of the object's particles refused to stay still. They blurred, they shifted, they formed geometric patterns that made my eyes ache, only to dissolve back into random static the moment I tried to focus on them. I was running on fumes, a ghost haunting my own life. By the afternoon of the second day, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the whispers. It was the people. Conversations in the break room abruptly died when I walked through the door. Researchers who had sat next to me for years suddenly remembered urgent calibrations they needed to run in the testing labs. Even Daniel Cooper, the man I had seen on the impossible security footage, kept a wide berth. I caught him watching me from across the central display console. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes were tight, panicked. Whenever I took a step in his direction, he would immediately gather his tablets and hurry away. I was radioactive, a localized quarantine zone of one. The isolation should have broken me, but instead, it sharpened my paranoia. The yellow post note was still folded perfectly in my pocket. Every time I reached my hand and the rough texture of the paper grounded me. You have to leave now. It was the only tangible proof I had that I wasn't entirely insane, that something real, something physical was hunting me. On the third night, driven half mad by the lack of sleep and the relentless murmuring in my head, I surrendered. I opened the bottle of heavy sedatives Dr. Lansing had prescribed. I swallowed a thick, chalky white pill, desperate for just 1 hour of silence. It was a mistake. The medication didn't stop the whispers. It only paralyzed my body's ability to fight them. I fell into a suffocating, waking nightmare. My limbs felt like they were encased in wet cement, heavy and immovable on the mattress. But my mind was wide awake, trapped in a foggy, chemical haze. In that twilight state, the voices didn't just sound louder, they felt physical. I could feel the cold breath of the whispers against my cheek. I could hear different cadences, different tones. Men, women, children. Voices that sounded like mine. Voices that sounded like scraping metal. They rose and fell in a chaotic symphony, pushing me right to the edge of the abyss. When my alarm finally blared at 6 o'clock, signaling the start of the fourth day, I didn't feel like I had woken up. I felt like a corpse being forced to walk. I went through the motions of my shift on pure autopilot. The research floor was a blur of gray and white. I was returning from a mandatory equipment check in the auxiliary testing lab, dragging my feet along the polished linoleum of corridor when the air pressure in the hallway suddenly dropped. It felt like the moment right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The whispers in my head abruptly ceased. Total, absolute silence. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard silence in nearly 100 hours. It was deafening. I looked up. Standing at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, was Emily. My heart physically lurched in my chest. She was wearing the same oversized, faded blue sweater she had been wearing during our video call a week ago. Her auburn hair caught the overhead light. She looked small against the massive, blast-proof doors behind her. Her face was pale, contorted into a mass of pure, bewildered terror. She was looking around the sterile metal hallway as if she had just woken up from a dream and found herself on the surface of the moon. My brain completely misfired. Logic evaporated. The pool was 200 miles from the nearest landmass. It was hundreds of feet underwater. It required 7 biometric clearances to even step off the elevator. It was physically impossible for her to be here. But the human heart doesn't care about physics. Emily? I gasped, the sound tearing out of my dry throat. Her head snapped toward me. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by profound, desperate relief. She opened her mouth to call out my name, but no sound came out. Before she could take a single step toward me, the air behind her seemed to ripple. 2 figures materialized out of the shadows of the blast doors. They were wearing the heavy, tactical black armor of the pool's elite security force. They moved with terrifying, silent precision. Each guard grabbed one of her arms. They didn't strike her, but their grip was absolute. They began dragging her backward. "Wait!" I screamed, the silence of the corridor shattering. I broke into a dead sprint. "Emily, stop! Let her go!" She twisted in their grip, looking back over her shoulder. Our eyes met for one agonizing second. I saw the tears spilling down her cheeks. I saw her lips forming my name, and then the guards dragged her sharply around the corner of the corridor. I hit the corner at a full run, my boots skidding on the polished floor, my hands reaching out to grab whoever I could find. The adjoining hallway was completely empty. There were no guards. There was no Emily. There wasn't even the echo of footsteps. The corridor stretched out for 100 yards in a perfectly straight, unbroken line of gray metal and white light. It was a dead end. There were no doors that could have pulled her through. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving, staring at the empty space. "No!" I whispered to the sterile air. "No, she was here. I saw her." Panic, pure and blinding, overrode whatever caution Peterson's threats had instilled in me. I threw myself at the nearest emergency communication panel on the wall, slamming my palm against the biometric scanner. The screen flashed red, then green. "Security!" This is Researcher Hughes. Code red breach in corridor E. Unauthorized civilian personnel detained by tactical units. I need to speak to Chief Sanders immediately. I demand to speak to Sanders. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the freezing, windowless office of Robert Sanders, the chief of security for the pool. Sanders was a man carved out of granite, a military veteran who treated the facility with the reverence of a holy temple. He sat behind his desk, his massive arms crossed, watching me with a look of extreme, strained patience. He tapped a key on his console, and a large monitor on the wall hummed to life. "This is a surveillance feed for Corridor E, covering the exact time frame you specified," Sanders said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of his desk. The black and white footage showed the long, empty hallway. After a few seconds, I walked into the frame from the bottom. I looked exhausted, dragging my feet. Then, on the screen, I stopped dead. I stared straight ahead down the empty corridor. I watched myself drop my clipboard. I watched my mouth open as I shouted a name. I watched myself break into a sprint, running frantically toward the far corner of the hallway, waving my arms. I watched myself chase absolutely nothing. There was no Emily on the screen. There were no security guards. There was just a tired, broken man screaming at thin air. "There," I said, pointing a trembling finger at the monitor, my voice cracking. "Right there." She was standing right in front of the blast doors. Sanders paused the footage. The image froze on my desperate, running form. "Hughes!" Sanders said softly, a tone that felt entirely wrong coming from him. There is no one there. That's impossible. The feed has been altered. Someone wiped her from the data. I saw her, Sanders. I saw the blue sweater. I saw the guards. They were wearing your tactical gear. Sanders let out a heavy sigh and rewound the footage, playing it again. The result was exactly the same. Altered. Sanders countered, leaning forward. By whom? And why? Do you have any idea the level of clearance required to scrub a real-time localized feed without leaving a digital artifact? It requires director-level access. Then Peterson did it, or whoever bypassed my workstation cameras. Sanders folded his hands. The sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold, hard line of authority. Director Peterson briefed me on your condition, Hughes. He mentioned you've been under observation. Working in this environment, it takes a toll. The pressure, the lack of sunlight, the isolation, it causes perceptual issues. I am not hallucinating. I slammed my fist on the desk, but even as the echo of the blow faded in the small office, a cold, sickening doubt began to crawl up the back of my throat. What was more likely? That my partner, a second-grade teacher from a landlocked state, had somehow bypassed the most sophisticated military quarantine on the planet, descended to the bottom of the ocean, and appeared in my specific hallway just to vanish into thin air? Or that my brain, starved of sleep and battered by 3 days of phantom whispers, had finally snapped entirely? Sanders saw the hesitation in my eyes. He capitalized on it. I'm going to recommend you go back to Dr. Lansing, Sanders said quietly. In the meantime, I will authorize a full tactical sweep of the E-block ventilation and maintenance shafts, just to be thorough. But Hughes, I stood up, feeling completely hollowed out. The object affects people in different ways, Sanders added, his eyes locking onto mine, even those of us who've been here a long time. I froze with my hand on the door handle. It was almost word for word what Thomas Bell, the senior researcher, had muttered to me days ago. The object affects people. I didn't say anything. I just walked out. When I returned to the research floor, the atmosphere had deteriorated from avoidance to open hostility. Researchers were huddled in small, tight clusters near the coffee stations and server racks. The moment the hydraulic doors hissed open and I stepped onto the floor, the talking ceased. Every head turned to look at me. The silence was heavy, thick with judgment. I caught fragments of hushed whispers as I made the long walk to my desk. Unstable? Security risk? Happened before? I sank into my chair, burying my face in my hands. The whispers inside my head, which had paused during my hallucination of Emily, rushed back in with vengeance. They were louder now, more urgent. It sounded like a crowd panicking before a fire. I forced myself to look up. Across the semicircle of desks, Daniel Cooper was standing at the central holographic display console. He wasn't avoiding me anymore. He was ignoring me entirely, completely absorbed in whatever was rendering on the massive screen. 3 other senior mapping technicians were flanking him, their faces bathed in the blue light of the hologram. Their voices carried across the quiet room. It's a rendering error, one of the technicians said, his voice high and tight. It has to be. Run the diagnostic again. We've checked the equipment 3 times. Daniel snapped back, rubbing the back of his neck. The sensors are calibrated perfectly. The hardware is fine. It's the data that's wrong. Data doesn't do this, Dan. Then tell me what I'm looking at. Daniel ordered, because I need to be absolutely certain before I take this to Peterson. I couldn't help myself. The sheer terror in Daniel's voice cut to the fog of my own misery. I stood up and walked toward the central console. As I approached, the other technicians immediately stepped back, creating a wide berth around me. But Daniel was too transfixed by the screen to notice. What's going on? I asked, stopping right beside him. Daniel flinched, his head snapping toward me. For a second, I thought he was going to run again, but he just looked exhausted. He looked back at the holographic display. Mapping anomalies, Daniel muttered after a heavy pause. Nothing to worry about. Daniel, you're sweating. I pushed. What kind of anomalies? He sighed, running a trembling hand over his face. He leaned in close to me, dropping his voice so the rest of the room couldn't hear. Particles, Daniel whispered. We are tracking specific subatomic particles on the object's outer shell, and they are appearing in two locations simultaneously. I frowned, trying to process the physics through my sleep deprivation. Quantum entanglement? We've seen superposition states before. That's rare, but not entanglement, James, Daniel interrupted, his eyes wide and unblinking. We are talking about the exact same physical particle occupying two entirely distinct points in macrospace at the exact same time. Not a probability wave, a physical manifestation. He gestured wildly to the massive 3D model rotating above the console. Look at this. The red markers. I looked. The display showed a cross-section of the object. Dozens of glowing red dots pulsed across its surface. Every few seconds, a dot would flicker, and an identical red that would instantly appear on the complete opposite side of the object, pulse in unison and then vanish. According to the timestamps, Daniel said, his voice shaking, these particles are being recorded by completely separate sensor rays at the exact same microsecond. It's physically impossible. How long has this been happening? We first noticed it yesterday, he said. It was just one or two, but it's spreading. It's spreading through the entire atomic structure of the artifact. Daniel grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. James, this isn't just an anomaly. This violates the fundamental laws of linear physics. The object isn't just sitting there anymore. It's doing something to the space around it. Before I could formulate a response, a sharp, piercing beep sliced through the air. It was coming from my workstation, a standard auditory alert, signaling that a batch analysis had finished processing. I gently pulled my arm out of Daniel's grip and walked back to my desk. The eyes of the room followed me again, burning into my back. I sat down. I looked at my main monitor. It wasn't displaying an analysis report. The mapping software had been completely minimized. The screen was stark, blinding white. In the direct center of the monitor, printed in massive, stark black text, was a message. Time is running out. They know. My blood turned to ice. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I sat perfectly still, my eyes darting to the corners of the room. No one was looking at my screen. The message remained burned into the display for exactly 5 seconds. Then, the screen flickered, went black, and the standard analysis spreadsheet popped up, filling the monitor with mundane numbers as if nothing had ever happened. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely operate the mouse. I immediately bypassed the active software and dove into the localized security logs. I pulled the video feed from my workstation, setting the timestamp to exactly 10 minutes ago, right when I had walked over to speak with Daniel. The video loaded. My desk was empty. I watched myself walk out of the frame toward the central console. For 3 minutes, the frame was static. Then he walked in, my double, but he didn't look like he had the night. He left a post-it note. He looked worse. He looked hunted. His navy jumpsuit was stained with dark grease or blood. There was a fresh, jagged cut across his left cheekbone, still weeping red. He didn't hesitate. He dropped into my chair, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic, desperate speed. He was typing the message. When he finished, he didn't look around. He stopped, lifted his head, and stared directly into the camera lens. The sheer intensity of his gaze made me physically recoil from the monitor. It was a look of absolute, unapologetic urgency. Then, he stood up and walked briskly out of the frame, heading toward the maintenance corridors. I ripped my eyes away from the video and hammered the keys, pulling up the biometric entry logs from my specific terminal. To access the keyboard, the system required a continuous fingerprint read from the haptic desk pad. The log was completely clean. According to the unalterable biometric data of the pool, no one had touched my terminal. No unauthorized user, no security override, nothing. The system swore the desk was empty, but the video showed a man with my face sitting in my chair. The whispers in my head erupted. It was no longer a murmur. It was a physical assault. The cacophony of voices screamed in unison, a mess of overlapping warnings, crying out in a language I couldn't understand, but whose panic was universal. The pressure in my skull felt like a physical weight trying to crack the bone from the inside. I couldn't stay in that room. I felt like the air was turning to poison. I violently pushed my chair back, ignoring the startled looks from the adjacent desks, and half ran toward the heavy blast doors leading out of the research wing. I needed to get to the residential quarters. I needed to lock myself in a dark room. I needed to think. I slammed my palm against the exit scanner. The doors hissed open, and I spilled out into the main transit corridor. The pool was built on a simple, logical architectural plan. It was essentially a massive wheel. The objects chamber was a hub in the center. The research labs, medical bays, and residential quarters formed concentric rings around it, connected by long, straight spoke corridors. I had walked these halls thousands of times. I could navigate them completely blindfolded during the blackout drills. I turned right at the first junction, expecting to see the long stretch of corridor C leading to the elevator banks. Instead, I found myself staring down a narrow, dimly lit maintenance tunnel. I stopped. I blinked hard, shaking my head to clear the fog. I must have taken a wrong turn in my panic. I spun around, intending to go back to the junction and reorient myself. But the junction wasn't there, where the wide, double-door entrance to the research wing should have been. There was now a solid, seamless wall of gray metal. My heart hammered against my ribs. I touched the cold metal. It was real, solid. I turned back around, facing the dim maintenance tunnel. Panic, raw and primal, flooded my system. The architecture of the facility had changed. I started walking down the tunnel, my footsteps echoing far too loudly. The walls felt closer together than they should be. The ceiling felt oppressively low. After 50 yards, the tunnel abruptly terminated at a heavy, reinforced door marked with a yellow hazard triangle. I had never seen this door in my 15 years at the pool. I pushed the heavy handle down. It opened with a groan. I stepped through, expecting to find a mechanical room. Instead, I found myself standing on the edge of the cafeteria. It made no logical sense. The cafeteria was on the opposite side of the facility. 2 levels up, it was spatially impossible to walk from the research wing directly into the dining hall through a single maintenance door. But there it was, the rows of metal tables, the sterile serving counters. It was completely empty, the lights dimmed from mid-afternoon lull. I backed away, letting the heavy door slam shut. I started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. I tore down corridors that stretched infinitely longer than their physical blueprints should allow. I passed intersections that branched off at impossible, non-Euclidean angles, creating shadows that seemed to bend back on themselves. I opened a door that always led to the central stairwell and found myself staring into a massive, dark storage hangar filled with rusted, archaic equipment that didn't belong to our era. The facility was rearranging itself. It was as if the blueprint of the pool was being shuffled like a deck of cards by an invisible hand. And the whispers in my head matched the shifting geometry, rising in a chaotic crescendo every time a hallway dead-ended into a solid wall. I was trapped in a shifting maze. I leaned against a cold bulkhead, gasping for air, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I was losing my mind. The isolation, the lack of sleep, the whispers. It had finally broken me. Peterson was right. James! The voice echoed from the end of the corridor. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I looked up, standing 20 feet away, silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights of a cross corridor, was Thomas Bell, the senior researcher, the oldest man in the facility. His thick glasses caught the light, obscuring his eyes. Thomas. I breathed, scrambling to my feet. Thomas, thank God. The hallways, they're wrong. The doors are all in the wrong places. I tried to go to the elevators, but the walls... I stopped, realizing how utterly insane I sounded. But Thomas didn't look at me with pity or fear. He looked at me with a profound, terrifying sorrow. He didn't look at the walls. He looked right at me. What are you doing in Sector C, James? Thomas asked quietly. Your quarters are in the E-wing. I got lost. I admitted, the words catching in my throat. Everything looks different. Thomas slowly nodded. He took a step forward, his posture rigid. He gestured down the corridor behind him. Come on, keep your eyes on the floor directly in front of you. Don't look at the intersections. I'll walk with you. I didn't argue. I fell into step slightly behind him, keeping my eyes locked on the scuffed heels of his boots. We walked in absolute silence. The only sound was a hum of the air recyclers and the chaotic whispers still tearing through my skull. But as we walked behind Thomas, the impossible geometry seemed to settle. When we turned a corner, it was a correct corner. When we passed the doorway, it led to the right room. It was as if Thomas's sheer, stubborn belief in the facility's layout was forcing reality to conform back to its original shape. Within 5 minutes, the familiar, comforting sight of the E-Wing residential corridor appeared. We stopped outside the door to my quarters. Thank you, I said, leaning heavily against the doorframe, the relief making me dizzy. I don't know what happened back there. It was like the whole place just broke. Thomas looked up and down the empty corridor. He looked at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Its red light was a steady, unblinking eye. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice until it was barely a breath. James, Thomas whispered, how long have the whispers been keeping you awake? The floor seemed to drop out from underneath me. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I hadn't told anyone about the voices. I hadn't put it in a report. I hadn't mentioned it to the doctor. I had guarded that secret with my life. How do you? I stammered. I have been here since they cut that thing out of the ice. Thomas interrupted, his voice laced with a heavy, ancient exhaustion. I was here before Peterson. I was here before the new security protocols. I've watched it happen before. After a while, you learn to spot the signs when it starts to communicate. Communicate? I grabbed his arm. Thomas, you mean the voices, they're real? They're coming from the object. Thomas gently pulled his arm away. He looked terrified. It doesn't always choose the same person. It probes. It looks for a resonance. Last time it was Ryan Ward. The name hit me like a physical blow. Ryan Ward? I don't know that name. Who is he? Thomas's eyes darted back to the ceiling camera. He took a half step back, creating distance between us. Not here. We cannot talk here. The walls have ears, and right now, those ears belong to people who will erase you if they think you know too much. Before I could ask another question, Thomas reached out. He grabbed my hand and pressed something small, hard, and metallic into my palm. He folded my fingers over it tightly. Tomorrow, Thomas whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with a desperate intensity. Tomorrow, when you are ready to know the truth. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked quickly down the corridor. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps echoing until he rounded the far corner and vanished from sight. I stood alone in the hallway for a long time. The whispers in my head were a low, steady thrum. Waiting, I swiped my badge, stepped into my dark quarters, and locked the heavy door behind me. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked over to the edge of my bed and slowly opened my clenched fist. Resting in the center of my palm was a small, black, encrypted data chip. It was an older model, the kind that hadn't been used in the facility's main terminals for nearly a decade. It was the exact same kind of chip my double had shoved into Daniel Cooper's chest on security footage. I stared at it in the darkness, the 0.3% harmonic shift vibrating in the marrow of my bones. Ryan Ward, a man who supposedly didn't exist, who had heard the same voices driving me insane. I didn't know what was on the chip, but as the whispers in my head began to slowly synchronize again, forming the edges of words I couldn't quite understand, I knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. The object wasn't just a rock in the water. It was a door, and someone or something was trying to open it. I sat in the suffocating darkness of my quarters, the encrypted data chip resting in the palm of my hand like a lead weight. It was a relic, an obsolete piece of hardware from a time before the pool's network had been completely isolated and upgraded to its current unbreachable architecture. I rolled it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the warm metallic edges. The current terminals on the research floor didn't even have ports for something like this. If I tried to force an adapter, the internal security sweeps would instantly flag the anomaly and lock me out. I needed a legacy system, I needed an access point that had been overlooked by the relentless modernization of the facility. And all the while, the whispers kept gnawing at the edges of my sanity. They had changed again. The chaotic, overlapping panic had subsided into a rhythmic, pulsing chant. It wasn't a language, but I could feel the intent behind it. A countdown, a gathering of breath before a massive scream. I taped the chip to the underside of my desk drawer, right in the blind spot of the standard physical search, and finally collapsed onto my bed. Sleep, when it came, was a series of jagged, fragmented nightmares. I saw myself standing in 100 different versions of the pool. In some, the facility was a rusted, flooded tomb. In others, it was a gleaming fortress of impossible geometry. But in every single dream, the object in the center of the chamber was cracking open, bleeding blinding white light into the dark ocean. The summons came the next day, right in the middle of the cafeteria's lunch cycle. A security officer in full tactical gear, the same gear I had seen on the men dragging the Phantom Emily away, approached my isolated table. He didn't ask. He simply ordered, "Researcher Hughes, your presence is required in Conference Room A, immediately." Conference Room A was a massive, sterile vault typically reserved for quarterly reviews with the shadowy government liaisons who funded our isolation. I followed the guard through the long, gray corridors. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew this wasn't performance review. This was an execution of my career and possibly my freedom. When the heavy blast door slid open, the air inside was freezing. 3 men were waiting for me. Director William Peterson sat at the head of the long, polished metal table, a man carved from ice and bureaucracy. To his right, standing perfectly still with his arms crossed, was Robert Sanders, the chief of security. And sitting halfway down the table, staring intensely at a physical file folder in front of him, was Thomas Bell. "Sit, Hughes," Peterson commanded, his voice devoid of any human warmth. I took the single empty chair opposite Thomas. The polished surface of the table reflected my face. I looked like a corpse, eyes sunken, skin sallow, a man completely hollowed out by fear and sleep deprivation. "Do you know why you are here?" Peterson asked, opening a sleek digital tablet. "I assume it's about my mental health," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "Among other things," Peterson said smoothly, "in the past 7 days, you logged an impossible acoustic deviation. You have accused a senior colleague of forging security footage. You triggered a code red alert over a civilian hallucination in a secure corridor. And yesterday, you were found wandering the maintenance levels, claiming the physical architecture of the facility was changing." Peterson steepled his fingers, staring right through me. "Dr. Lansing reports you have not been taking your prescribed antipsychotics. Chief Sanders reports you are accessing restricted areas. You are unraveling, Hughes, fast." I looked at Thomas, desperate for an ally, but the old researcher's face was an unreadable mask. "I am not unraveling," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "Something is happening to the object. I'm not the only one seeing it. The mapping team found particles occupying 2 points in space-time simultaneously. My double, the man with my face, he bypassed your unbreachable security. You can drug me all you want, Peterson, but it doesn't change the fact that reality in this facility is breaking down." Sanders stepped forward from the wall, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. "Auditory hallucinations and stress-induced paranoia. You need permanent medical reassignment. Hughes, a secure facility upstate. It's for your own safety. Reassignment." The word hung in the cold air. In the history of the pool, no one was ever reassigned. You worked here until you retired or you died here. Reassignment was a euphemism for being locked in a padded cell until the secrets in your head rotted away. Anger, hot and pure, finally pierced my exhaustion. I looked right at Peterson. What happened to Ryan Ward? The reaction was instantaneous, and it was terrifying. Sanders' hand twitched toward the sidearm holstered at his waist. Peterson's icy demeanor cracked, his eyes widening in genuine shock. And Thomas Bell froze, his hand hovering over his file folder. The silence in the room became a physical weight. "Where did you hear that name?" Peterson's voice dropped an octave, losing its bureaucratic polish. It was the voice of a predator. "It doesn't matter." I shot back, leaning forward. Who was he? And what happened to him? Peterson closed his tablet with a sharp, echoing snap. Ryan Ward was a junior researcher who suffered a severe psychological break identical to yours. He was transferred to an off-site medical facility 5 years ago. His records are sealed. "You're lying," I said. "This is a classified briefing, Hughes," Sanders growled, taking another step toward me. "You do not have the clearance." "I have the clearance." The voice was quiet, but it commanded the room instantly. We all turned to Thomas Bell. The old man took off his thick glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted. He looked defeated. "Thomas, do not do this," Peterson warned, his tone suddenly lethal. "I am invoking Section 12 of the Primary Research Charter," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly, but holding firm. Peterson's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. Section 12. I had only heard rumors of it. A fail-safe clause written by the original founders of the pool, allowing a senior researcher to breach protocol and share highly classified information if they believed maintaining the secret posed an existential threat to the facility itself. "You are throwing your life away, Bell," Sanders said, his hand still resting near his weapon. "I've lived long enough," Thomas replied. He turned his tired eyes to me. "James, what you are experiencing is not unique. It's not a hallucination. The object, it isn't just a relic from an ancient civilization." Thomas slid the physical file folder across the polished table. It stopped inches from my hands. It was stamped with stark red classification. Space-time anomalies. Eyes only. "For years," Thomas continued, "we have documented reality distortions near the artifact. Minor things at first. Equipment recording data from hours in the future. Footprints appearing in empty, sealed rooms. But it's escalating. The object is not a passive artifact. It is an anchor, a doorway." I opened the folder. The first page was a high-resolution photograph. It was the security footage I had seen on my terminal. My double, sitting in my chair, writing the yellow post-it note. "You knew!" I whispered, staring at the photo. I looked up at Peterson. "You knew I was telling the truth, and you were going to lock me in a psych ward anyway." "Protocol," Peterson said, his face completely devoid of remorse. "To prevent a facility-wide panic. The work is more important than your individual sanity. You're the fourth person to reach this stage," Thomas said gently, drawing my attention back. "The object probes the minds of the people working closest to it. It finds a frequency it likes. First it was Keller, 12 years ago. Then Matthews. Then, 5 years ago, Ryan Ward. And they were transferred." I asked, though my gut already knew the horrible truth. Thomas shook his head slowly. "They vanished. Keller stepped into a decontamination shower and never stepped out. Matthews walked into a dead-end corridor and ceased to exist on camera. Ward disappeared from his locked quarters during a massive facility-wide power failure." "Vanished where?" I demanded. "Into the object," Thomas said. "Or, more accurately, into the doorway the object creates. We believe they crossed over. The whispers you are hearing, they are bleed-through from overlapping timelines, realities where the pool exists, but events played out differently. The object is a bridge across the multiverse, James. And right now, that bridge is opening." I stared at the three men. The magnitude of it threatened to crush me. "Why are you telling me this? Why not just drug me and throw me in a cell?" "Because," Peterson said, leaning forward, the cold calculation returning to his eyes, "we need an active, receptive subject to monitor the Convergence event. The object has chosen you as its current focal point. We want you to document the experiences. We want you to let the whispers in. But you will do it under our absolute chemical control. You will wear biometric monitors. You will take a specialized inhibitor drug that prevents full psychological collapse while allowing the anomalies to manifest." It wasn't a choice. It was a hostage situation. I was a lab rat being offered a slightly larger cage in exchange for walking directly into the fire. And if I refuse? I asked. Sanders smiled. "It was an ugly, violent thing. Then we sedate you right now. and you wake up in a padded room with no windows for the rest of your natural life. Your choice, researcher. I looked down at the shiny metal table. I needed time. I needed to access that data chip. I needed to figure out what Ryan Ward knew before he vanished. Fine, I lied, keeping my eyes cast down. I'll cooperate. Excellent, Peterson said briskly. Standing up, Chief Sanders will escort you to medical to begin the new chemical protocol. You are dismissed. As Peterson and Sanders turned to gather their things, I looked back down at the polished metal table. The reflection of my face stared back up at me, except the reflection wasn't moving. I blinked. I tilted my head. The reflection stayed perfectly still, looking up at me with an expression of intense, burning urgency, while the real me sat paralyzed with shock. The reflection of my double leaned forward in the metal surface. His lips moved, exaggerating the syllables so I could read them perfectly, even without sound. Find Ryan Ward. I gasped, pushing my chair back. Peterson and Sanders snapped their heads toward me. When I looked back at the table, the reflection was normal again, a perfect, terrified mirror image mimicking my own panic. Is there a problem, Hughes? Sanders asked, his hand dropping back to his belt. No, I managed to choke out, forcing my heart rate down. Just dizzy from the lack of sleep. I allowed Sanders to march me down to the medical bay. I let Dr. Lansing inject a cold, thick liquid into my arm and attach a heavy, tamper-proof biometric collar to my neck. I played the broken, compliant scientist perfectly, but my mind was racing. Find Ryan Ward. According to Thomas, Ward had vanished into the object, but my reflection was telling me to find him, which meant Ward hadn't crossed over. Or, if he had, he left something crucial behind. Something Peterson and Sanders hadn't found. The moment I was released back to the general population with my new monitoring collar flashing a steady green, I began the hunt. I couldn't use a digital network. My keystrokes were undoubtedly being monitored now. I had to go analog. During the shift change, when the corridors were flooded with exhausted researchers trading places with a night crew, I slipped into the Central Administrative Archives. It was a massive, dusty room filled with ceiling-high metal filing cabinets. In an age of quantum computing, nobody ever came down here. It was a graveyard of paper. I moved quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the heavy hand of Chief Sanders to grab my shoulder. I navigated to the incident reports from 5 years ago. I pulled the physical file for the massive power failure that Thomas mentioned, the night Ryan Ward supposedly vanished. March 12th, total critical systems failure. 6 hours and 23 minutes of absolute blackout. No cameras, no biometric locks. A perfect window to disappear. But it was the maintenance logs attached to the back of the file that made my breath catch. 3 days after the blackout, a work order had been filed for residential quarter E17. The quarter assigned to Ryan Ward. Work order: replace damaged acoustic ceiling panel and repair adjacent ventilation access point. I shoved the file back into the cabinet, my hands shaking. The pool was a fortress, but the ventilation system was the one physical vulnerability. A maze of narrow, interconnected ducts running above the drop ceilings. I waited until the facility's night cycle officially began, casting the corridors in deep, bruising blue light. I bypassed my own room and ghosted down the E-wing toward quarter 17. The door was unlocked, standard protocol for unassigned empty rooms. I slipped inside, letting the door click shut. The room was a sterile, empty box, just a bare metal bed frame and a desk. I immediately climbed onto the desk, balancing carefully, and pushed my hands against the acoustic tiles of the ceiling. The third tile I pushed gave way, lifting up into the dark void above. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, gripped the metal framing, and hoisted myself up until my head and shoulders broke through into the claustrophobic maintenance space. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old ozone. I swept the beam of the flashlight over the tangled mess of silver ductwork and thick black electrical cables. There, pushed deep into the corner where the ceiling met the load-bearing bulkhead, was a small, dark object. I stretched my arm out, my shoulders screaming in protest, my fingers brushing against cold leather. I grabbed it and pulled it down. It was a journal, bound in thick, cracked black leather, completely covered in a layer of gray dust. I dropped back down onto the desk, my hands trembling as I brushed the dirt off the cover. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with frantic, cramped handwriting. Day 872 at the pool. The first entry began. The whispers started 3 days ago. I sank onto the bare metal bed frame, reading by the dim blue emergency light bleeding under the door. It was a mirror of my own descent into hell. Ward detailed the exact same auditory hallucinations, the same crushing paranoia. He wrote about seeing his own double staring back at him from security monitors. He wrote about finding notes he hadn't written. But Ward had gone further. He had been a quantum topographer, mapping the spatial coordinates around the object. I turned a page, staring at a highly detailed, hand-drawn map of the object containment chamber. Ward had marked specific, intersecting points around the massive artifact with red ink. Thin spots, he called them. The object isn't just sitting in our reality. It's a weight resting on a taut sheet. The heavier it gets, the more the sheet stretches. These red marks are where the membrane of our universe is tearing, where the other timelines are bleeding through. They are lying to us. Peterson knows. They aren't trying to study it. They are waiting for the convergence. I read faster, the hairs on my arms standing up. Day 885. I saw Matthews today, the man who vanished 3 years ago. I saw him in the Sea Wing corridor, but he wasn't a ghost. He was solid. He was bleeding. He looked right at me, screaming silently. He is still in the pool, but a different version of it. A version where something went horribly wrong. The object isn't just a door, it's a floodgate. When the convergence reaches critical mass, all these realities are going to smash into each other. It will destroy everything. I flipped to the final entry, dated March 11th, the day before the blackout. I cannot let them witness the convergence. The whispers are deafening now. The alternate versions of myself are trying to guide me. Tomorrow night, the monthly supply helicopter arrives. It's the only time the outer blast doors open. I have mapped the automated security overrides. I am going to trigger a cascade failure in the main reactor, a total blackout. I will use the chaos to reach the helipad. If anyone finds this, know that the doorway cannot be contained. It must be destroyed. Code to access the legacy terminal bypass is 22-4-8-1. I stared at the numbers. 22,481. Ward hadn't been pulled into the object. He had engineered the blackout to escape on the supply chopper. Had he made it, or had Sanders caught in the dark? It didn't matter right now. What mattered was the code. I shoved the journal into my jumpsuit, replacing the ceiling tile, and sprinted back to my own quarters. I locked my door, retrieved the black data chip Thomas had given me from under the desk, and booted up my personal terminal. The screen glowed a harsh, bright white. I bypassed the standard login screen, bringing up the raw command prompt. My fingers flew across the keys, entering the sequence Ward had left behind. Override sequence initiated. Protocol 22,481. The screen flashed green. A legacy operating system, raw and unmonitored by Peterson's modern surveillance grid. Booted up. I jammed the black data chip into the archaic port on the side of the terminal. A single PDF file appeared on the desktop. Author, Dr. Thomas Bell. Date, 2006. Title, The Convergent Hypothesis, Classified Omega. I opened it. It was a theoretical physics paper written 20 years ago, long before I ever arrived at the pool. As I read Thomas's words, the true, apocalyptic horror of the facility finally crystallized in my mind. Thomas hadn't just discovered the object was multiversal. He had deduced its purpose. The artifact acts as a cosmic tuning fork, Thomas wrote. It was not created by humanity. It was placed here. It broadcasts a resonance across the multiverse, searching for realities with the technological capability to awaken it. Once the artifact is sufficiently stimulated, once it reaches a critical energy threshold, it initiates a convergence event. If the convergence completes, the barriers between timelines will collapse permanently. Countless parallel realities will attempt to occupy the exact same spatial coordinates. The resulting metaphysical friction, will result in total reality degradation. The universe will not end in fire or ice. It will end in a catastrophic structural collapse of space-time itself. We are not studying an artifact. We are playing with a detonator to a multiversal bomb. I slumped back in my chair, the breath knocked out of me. Peterson knew. Sanders knew. They weren't trying to stop it. Their hubris made them think they could study the explosion from the inside. They were feeding the object energy, waiting for the door to open so they could peek inside. My double, the aggressive one I saw in the footage handing the chip to Daniel, he wasn't trying to stop it either. He wanted it to happen. The whispers in my head, which had been a steady hum, suddenly spiked. It felt like a physical spike of ice driven through my forehead. I cried out, grabbing my skull, tumbling out of the chair onto the cold metal floor. The voices weren't chaotic anymore. They were singing, a terrifying, harmonious chord that vibrated so violently the metal desk rattled against the wall. And then, the digital clock on my wall hit 3:17 a.m. The facility's alarms triggered. It wasn't a standard beep of a security sweep. It was the Alpha Protocol alarm, a sound I had only heard in drills, a high-pitched, oscillating shriek designed to cut through sleep and induce immediate adrenaline. The blue emergency lights in my room snapped to a violent, pulsing strobe red. The PA system crackled to life. It was Sanders. His voice wasn't authoritative. It was laced with raw, unadulterated panic. Attention, all personnel. Protocol Alpha is in effect. Catastrophic containment breach in the central chamber. Repeat, catastrophic breach in the central chamber. This is not a drill. All non-combat personnel brace for immediate structural impact. The floor beneath me heaved. It wasn't an earthquake. It felt like the entire facility had been picked up by a giant hand and violently shaken. The metal walls groaned, screaming under a sudden impossible pressure. The whispers in my head coalesced into a single, booming voice that echoed not just in my mind, but seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. It is happening. The door is opening. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering like a machine gun. I rushed to my door and slapped the biometric pad. A harsh red X flashed. Lockdown during an Alpha protocol. The residential doors magnetically seal to quarantine the population. I was trapped. I stepped back, looking up at the ceiling. Ward's escape route. I dragged my desk chair to the center of the room, ignoring the violent shaking of the floor, and leaped up. I punched the acoustic tile out of the frame, grabbing the metal supports and hauling myself up into the pitch-black maintenance crawl space. Dust choked my lungs. The heat up here was suffocating, thick with the smell of burning insulation. Red emergency lights pulsed through the grates below, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the ductwork. I had to get to the central chamber. I had Ward's map. I had the locations of the thin spots. If the convergence was starting, I was the only one who knew how to turn the object's energy back on itself. I began to crawl, dragging myself over heavy power lines, the metal biting into my knees and elbows. Below me, I could hear the muffled screams of other researchers trapped in their rooms, pounding on the doors. The facility was tearing itself apart. I shimmied forward, navigating by memory, heading toward the hub of the wheel. Suddenly, the metal grating beneath me gave way with a sickening crack. I plunged downward in a shower of sparks and falling ceiling tiles. I hit a solid metal floor hard, the breath exploding from my lungs, my vision swimming with stars. I rolled over, coughing violently, trying to orient myself in the flashing red strobe lights. I wasn't in the residential wing anymore. I had dropped directly into the primary access corridor leading to the blast doors of the central chamber. And I wasn't alone. Standing 10 feet away from me, framed by the flashing red lights, was a man in a navy blue jumpsuit. He was holding a heavy, tactical pulse rifle. He slowly lowered the weapon, staring at me. He had a jagged, weeping cut across his left cheekbone. It was my double, the one who wanted the world to end. He smiled. It was my face. But the expression was utterly alien, completely devoid of empathy. "You're late, James," he said, his voice echoing perfectly with my own. "But you're just in time for the end." I stared up at my own face. The harsh, pulsing red of the Protocol Alpha emergency lights washed over the jagged cut on his cheek. making the blood look black. He held a heavy tactical pulse rifle with a relaxed, practiced ease, the barrel pointed directly at my chest. For a terrifying second, my exhausted brain couldn't process the reality of it. The whispers in my head were a deafening, chaotic roar, screaming at me from 1,000 different timelines. But this man in front of me wasn't phantom. He wasn't a hallucination projected by the object. He had mass. He had weight. He was breathing the same stale, ozone-scorched air I was. "You're late, James," he repeated, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm over the grinding, metallic groans of the facility tearing itself apart. "But you're just in time for the end." I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, the metal grating of the floor biting into my skin. The dust from the collapsed ceiling choked my lungs. "Who are you?" I gasped, tasting copper. "You're the one who left the warning." The yellow note. My double let out a short, harsh laugh. It sounded utterly alien coming from my own throat. "You really are blind, aren't you?" "That wasn't me. The man who left you that note, the pathetic, haggard version of us who begged you to leave. He wasn't trying to save your life. He was trying to remove you from the board. He wanted you gone so you wouldn't be here to interfere. He was weak. He wanted to keep the door closed." The double took a slow, deliberate step forward, the heavy boots echoing over the blaring alarms. "There are countless versions of us, James. In some timelines, we fight to keep the containment field active. In others, we run like cowards. But in my timeline, I listened. I understood what the creators were offering. I've been working with them for years, waiting for the residents to reach across the multiverse and find a primary anchor. This timeline, your timeline, is the anchor. You are the focal point." The floor violently pitched beneath us. A massive, shuddering boom echoed from the central chamber just down the corridor. The heavy reinforced walls groaned, the rivets popping like gunshots as the crushing pressure of the Pacific Ocean fought against the failing structural integrity of the pool. "What are you doing?" I demanded, forcing myself up to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. "Thomas Bell's paper, Ward's journal, you're triggering a convergence. You're going to destroy reality." "I am destroying a prison," he shouted, his calm facade finally cracking, replaced by a fanatical, blinding zealotry. "We are trapped in a three-dimensional cage, mapping atoms of a lock we were too terrified to pick. The object isn't a bomb, James. It's an evolution. Yes, this specific iteration of reality will collapse. The timelines will crush into a single point. But what emerges from that pressure will be godhood. The creators will pull us through." He leveled the pulse rifle directly at my face. The targeting laser painted a bright, burning red between my eyes. "The program I injected into the main console is already amplifying the object's natural resonance," he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "The containment field is acting as a megaphone, blasting the signal across the multiverse. The doorway is opening. I just need to make sure you don't play the hero and try to shut it." I couldn't think. The whispers in my head surged, a sudden, unified scream of pure survival instinct. I threw myself sideways, diving behind the thick, steel housing of a primary coolant pipe, just as the deafening crack of the pulse rifle shattered the air. The superheated plasma bolt scorched the metal wall, exactly where my head had been, showering the corridor in blinding white sparks. "Don't fight it, James," my double yelled, his voice echoing in the narrow space. The heavy thud of his boots advanced on my position. "It's already over. Every reality is bleeding into this one." I pressed my back against the vibrating coolant pipe. I was unarmed. I was exhausted. I was running on nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. But I knew this corridor. I had walked these maintenance routes for 15 years. I knew every valve, every pressure gauge, every structural weakness. Right above my head was a manual release wheel for the secondary liquid nitrogen feeds used to cool the server clusters. I reached up, my fingers desperately gripping the icy metal of the heavy wheel. I heard him step around the corner of the pipe, the rifle raised. I threw all my body weight backward, wrenching the wheel violently to the left. With an ear-splitting hiss, the high-pressure valve blew open. A massive, blinding cloud of sub-zero liquid nitrogen erupted directly into the corridor. flooding the space with instantaneous, freezing white fog. My double screamed, a sound of pure agony as the freezing gas hit his face and eyes. The pulse rifle fired blindly into the fog, plasma bolts tearing chunks of metal from the ceiling, but he was firing wild. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I dropped to my stomach, crawling frantically beneath the rapidly expanding cloud of freezing vapor, scrambling toward the heavy blast doors of the central chamber. The cold burned my skin, searing my lungs with every ragged breath. But I didn't stop. I hit the manual override lever beside the massive doors and shoved my entire body weight against the heavy steel. The doors gave way, sliding open just enough for me to slip through. The moment I breached the central chamber, the sheer, impossible scale of the disaster hit me like a physical wall. The room was no longer the sterile, controlled laboratory I had known for 15 years. It was a cathedral of cosmic horror. The artificial daylight had completely failed, replaced by the violent, flashing red of the emergency strobes and the blinding, non-Euclidean light pouring out of the object. The object was no longer suspended in the center of the room. It was floating higher, rotating slowly, and it was tearing itself apart. Massive, glowing fissures crawled across its perfectly smooth, dark surface, leaking a pure, brilliant white energy that seemed to bend the very air around it. Looking directly at the light made my eyes water, my brain unable to process the geometry of the rays. It was as if a new primary color had been violently introduced into the universe, and it was screaming. The air pressure in the room was crushing. The gravity felt wrong, heavy in some spots, incredibly light in others. Loose data pad and pieces of shattered equipment floated lazily through the air, caught in localized anti-gravity pockets. And then there were the tears, all around the massive chamber. The fabric of reality was actively fraying. Slashes of thin air opened up, revealing terrifying glimpses into other timelines. Through a tear near the ceiling, I saw a version of the pool completely submerged, dark, crushing ocean water pressing against the metaphysical glass. Through a jagged rip near the main console, I saw a version of the chamber overgrown with massive, alien, bioluminescent flora. Ghostly, translucent figures of researchers and security guards from other realities flickered in and out of existence, running frantically through our space, unable to see us, screaming in a dozen different frequencies. Total multiversal collapse. In the center of the chaos, huddled behind the heavily reinforced glass of the primary control console, was a small group of survivors. I saw Daniel Cooper, his hands flying desperately across a scorched keyboard. I saw Dr. Kaminsky, the lead theoretical physicist, her face pale as a ghost, shouting readings into a dead headset. And standing behind them, clutching a heavy sidearm and looking like a cornered animal, was Director William Peterson. I sprinted across the observation deck, dodging a floating heavy metal chair, and slammed into the reinforced glass door of the control booth. I hammered my fist against it. Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with shock. He slammed the release button, and I fell into the booth, gasping for air. "Hughes!" Peterson barked, instantly raising his sidearm and pointing at my chest. "Get back! Chief Sanders warned me about your psychotic break. You cause this. Your sabotage. Put the gun down, you arrogant fool." I screamed, my voice cracking with pure rage. I didn't care about his authority anymore. Authority meant nothing when the universe was ending. I didn't do this. The anomaly did. The double. He injected a feedback loop into the containment field. He's using the dampeners to amplify the object signal. He's right, Dr. Kaminsky shouted, pulling up a violently fluctuating holographic graph. "Director, look at the telemetry. The containment field isn't holding the energy in. It's acting as a resonant cavity. It's broadcasting the artifact's frequency across the dimensional spectrum. We are literally ringing a bell for the rest of the multiverse." Peterson's face went slack, the gun wavering in his hand. The absolute control he had wielded for decades was evaporating in front of his eyes. "Can you shut it down?" he demanded, looking at Daniel. "I'm locked out," Daniel yelled, smashing his fist onto the console. The injected code encrypted the master overrides. "I can't cut the power to the field. I have the bypass," I said, stepping forward, ignoring Peterson's gun. I reached into my torn, dirty jumpsuit and pulled out Ryan Ward's leather-bound journal. I slammed it down onto the console between Daniel and Kaminsky. "This is Ward's journal," I said, flipping frantically through the dusty, cramped pages until I found a hand-drawn schematic of the chamber. He mapped the spatial topography around the object 5 years ago. He found the thin spots, the exact nodes where the dimensional membrane is weakest. Dr. Kaminsky leaned in, her eyes devouring the ink drawings. "Electromagnetic focal points," she whispered, the realization dawning on her face. He identified the exact vectors where the object is anchoring itself to our timeline. "Exactly," I said, my heart hammering. "If we can't shut the containment field down, we invert it. We manually decouple the dampener emitters, phase shift the frequency to exactly match the object's output, and we fire it directly into these thin spots. We don't try to hold the energy in. We force a localized feedback loop. We make the object consume its own signal." Daniel stared at the schematic, his mind racing, a closed-loop paradox. We weaponize the containment field against the artifact itself. It would force the doorway to collapse under its own metaphysical weight. "Can we do it?" Peterson demanded, his voice trembling. "Yes," Kaminsky said, her fingers already flying across a secondary, analog terminal. "But it requires entirely bypassing the digital safeties. We have to physically rewire the primary emitters from this console, and someone has to manually ride the frequency modulators. The object is going to fight back. It will constantly shift its resonance to break the loop. Someone has to sit at this desk, read the telemetry in real time, and manually adjust the counter frequency." The facility violently lurched again. The sound of rending metal was deafening. A massive crack spiderwebbed across the reinforced glass of the control booth. The automated Alpha Protocol voice blared over the sirens, distorted and skipping. "Warning, structural integrity at 19%. Catastrophic implosion imminent. All personnel proceed to designated evacuation zones. Primary supply transport has initiated emergency pre-flight." "The supply chopper," Daniel said, his eyes darting to the ceiling. "It's still on the upper helipad. We have maybe 10 minutes before the ocean crushes this entire sector into a tin can. Then we move," Peterson commanded, holstering his weapon, his self-preservation instinct overriding everything else. "Kaminsky, Cooper, you have 2 minutes to set up the analog bypass. Hughes, you're coming with us." "No," I said quietly. The room froze. They all looked at me. "Someone has to stay at the console," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the absolute chaos raging outside the glass. "Someone has to manually hold the frequency loop until the doorway completely collapses. If the loop drops for even a microsecond before the object seals, the convergence resumes, and the structural integrity of the multiverse shatters." "Hughes, that's suicide," Daniel said, his face pale. "The facility is going to implode. The pressure will crush this room into dust." "It's the only way," I replied, stepping up to the heavy leather chair in front of the primary analog console. I looked at the three of them. The object chose me. For whatever reason, across all these timelines, it anchored its resonance to my mind. I can hear the whispers. I can feel the frequency shifts before the sensors even register them. I'm the only one who can match its rhythm fast enough. Peterson looked at me, a complicated mix of relief and morbid respect crossing his cold features. He didn't argue. He just nodded once. "Dr. Kaminsky, make the analog patch. Now." For the next 90 seconds, the booth was a blur of frantic, desperate motion. Daniel and Kaminsky ripped open the access panels beneath the console, pulling heavy fiber optic cables and physically splicing them into the analog frequency modulators. Sparks showered the floor. The heat in the room spiked as the cooling systems failed entirely. Outside the glass, the object was reaching a terrifying crescendo. The cracks on its surface were now gaping chasms of blinding light. The dimensional tears in the room were widening, merging together. The deafening, multi-layered roar of a billion realities colliding was vibrating so intensely my teeth felt loose in my gums. "The patch is live." Kaminsky screamed over the noise, her hands covered in grease and blood from the frayed wires. "The analog modulators are tied directly to the primary dampeners. You have full manual control of the phase shift. Go! I told them, gripping the heavy metal dials of the modulators. The cold steel grounded me. Get to the chopper. Get as far away from the drop zone as you can. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. He reached out and gripped my shoulder tightly. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He turned, grabbed Kaminsky's arm, and alongside Peterson, they sprinted out of the control booth, disappearing into the chaotic, strobing red darkness of the evacuation corridors. I was entirely alone. I looked through the cracked glass at the floating, screaming monolith of light. The whispers in my head were no longer voices. They were a singular, crushing pressure, an overwhelming cosmic demand to submit, to let the door open, to let the realities wash over me. I looked down at the telemetry screens. The object's energy output was approaching the red line, the critical threshold of the convergence. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I placed my left hand on the primary phase dial and my right hand on the amplitude slider. I closed my eyes, tuning out the blaring sirens, tuning out the groaning metal of the crushing facility. I listened to the whispers. I felt the exact pitch, the exact horrifying frequency of the object's dimensional scream. I snapped my eyes open, wrenched the phase dial to mirror the frequency, shoved the amplitude to maximum, and slammed the heavy manual engage button with my fist. The entire facility shuddered with a force so violent I was nearly thrown from the chair. Outside the glass, the massive dampener arrays surrounding the chamber fired. But instead of an invisible humming shield, they unleashed a visible, blinding beam of inverted, corrupted energy. The beam struck the object perfectly on the red nodes Ward had drawn in his journal, the thin spots. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The object recoiled. It physically spasmed in the air. The blinding white light pouring from its fissures suddenly shifted into a sickly, violent violet. The feedback loop was established. The artifact was choking on its own multiversal signal. The monitors in front of me screamed with warnings. The object immediately shifted its frequency, trying to break the loop. The pitch in my head spiked, a sharp, stabbing pain behind my eyes. I wrenched the dial, chasing the frequency, matching it, pushing the inverted signal back down its throat. Warning, structural integrity at 12%, the automated voice droned. I didn't care. I was locked in a duel with a god trapped in a stone. The dimensional tears around the room began to thrash wildly. The edges of the rift sparked and burned, the conflicting realities fighting to maintain their grip on our space-time. And then, the secondary monitors on the console flickered to life, the security feeds from the surrounding corridors. But they weren't showing empty hallways. They were showing me dozens of screens, dozens of feeds, each showing a different version of James Hughes. I saw a version of myself sprinting toward the helipad, choosing survival. I saw a version of myself kneeling before the object, weeping in worship, his eyes burned out by the light. I saw the fanatic double, the one I had frozen with nitrogen, frozen solid in the corridor, a monument to his own hubris. I saw versions of me fighting, dying, hiding, surrendering. The creators were showing me the tapestry. They were showing me the infinite variations of my own cowardice and my own ambition. They were offering me a choice. Drop the loop, embrace the convergence, and become part of the infinite pattern. The whispers unified into a booming, seductive promise. Let go, become everything. I stared at the monitors. I stared at the infinite versions of myself who had failed. No! I whispered, the word tasting like ash and iron. I gripped the dials so hard my knuckles turned white. The object shifted frequency again, a massive, violent drop in pitch that nearly shattered my eardrums. I slammed the dial down, perfectly tracking the descent, locking the feedback loop in an absolute, suffocating grip. No! I screamed, my voice tearing my throat raw, echoing against the reinforced glass. I choose this one. I choose right here. I shoved the amplitude slider past the red line, overloading the physical circuits of the console. The smell of electrical fires filled the small booth. The dampener arrays outside overloaded, firing one final, devastating pulse of inverted energy directly into the core of the object. The monolith screamed. It was a sound that didn't belong in the physical world, a metaphysical screech of a doorway being violently, permanently slammed shut. The blinding light collapsed inward. The massive fissures on the surface of the object snapped shut like the jaws of a trap. The violet energy winked out of existence. The localized gravity pockets dissipated instantly, sending floating debris crashing violently to the metal floor. All around the chamber, the dimensional tears sparked, fizzled, and zipped shut, severing connections to the multiverse. The ghostly figures vanished. The alien jungles and flooded chambers faded back into the stark, gray reality of the pool. The object hit the floor of the containment chamber with a massive, booming thud, cracking the reinforced concrete. It was dark. It was completely, perfectly still, just a smooth, oblong, silent stone. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. Silence. Total, absolute, deafening silence in my mind. The whispers were gone. The thousands of voices, the multiversal echoes, the crushing presence of the creators. It was entirely gone. I was alone inside my own head for the first time in a week. I slumped back in a leather chair, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling with exhaustion. I looked at the telemetry screens. Dead. The dampeners had burned out completely. The feedback loop was gone, but the object was inert. The resonance was dead. The automated Alpha Protocol voice sputtered one final time. Warning. Structural integrity at 4%. Primary bulkheads failing. A deep, groaning shudder echoed from the walls above me. The sound of millions of tons of ocean water, finally breaking the spine of the facility. The central dome above the object began to buckle, massive spider webs of cracks racing across the thick glass, tiny jets of high-pressure water hissing through the fissures. I looked at the lone operational monitor on the far right of the console, the external feed from the upper helipad. Through the grainy night vision static, I watched the heavy transport helicopter lift off the pad, fighting against the driving rain and the turbulent Pacific winds. It banked sharply, turning its nose toward the mainland, toward Hawaii, toward Emily. They made it. The timeline was secure. The door was locked. I took my hands off the scorched dials of the console. I leaned back, closing my eyes, listening to the groaning metal of my underwater tomb. The water was coming. The pressure would be instantaneous. There wouldn't be any pain, just the dark and the quiet. I smiled, alone in the dark, at the bottom of the world. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't have to follow the routine. If you survive this descent into the crushing depths of the pool, if the whispers haven't driven you mad, and the walls of your own reality still feel solid, then you belong here with us in the dark. Don't let the silence fool you. There are always more doors waiting to be opened. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join us for more descents into the unknown, right here on Late Night Stories. Sleep tight if you can.